Dependency theory is the notion that resources flow from a periphery of poor and underdeveloped states to a core of wealthy states, enriching the latter at the expense of the former. It is a central contention of dependency theory that poor states are impoverished and rich ones enriched by the way poor states are integrated into the world system. The theory arose as a reaction to modernization theory, an earlier theory of development which held that all societies progress through similar stages of development, that today's underdeveloped areas are thus in a similar situation to that of today's developed areas at some time in the past, and that therefore the task in helping the underdeveloped areas out of poverty is to accelerate them along this supposed common path of development, by various means such as investment, technology transfers, and closer integration into the world market. Dependency theory rejected this view, arguing that underdeveloped countries are not merely primitive versions of developed countries, but have unique features and structures of their own. And, importantly, are in the situation of being the weaker members in a world market economy. Dependency theory no longer has many proponents as an overall theory, but some writers have argued for its continuing relevance as a conceptual orientation to the global division of wealth. Basics. The premises of dependency theory are that, poor nations provide natural resources, cheap labor, a destination for obsolete technology, and markets for developed nations, without which the latter could not have the standard of living they enjoy. Wealthy nations actively perpetuate a state of dependence by various means. This influence may be multifaceted, involving economics, media control, politics, banking and finance, education, culture, and sport. History. Dependency theory originates with two papers published in 1949, one by Hans Singer, one by Roy L. Prebisch, in which the authors observed that the terms of trade for underdeveloped countries relative to the developed countries had deteriorated over time. The underdeveloped countries were able to purchase fewer and fewer manufactured goods from the developed countries in exchange for a given quantity of their raw materials exports. This idea is known as the Singer-Prebisch thesis. Prebisch, an Argentine economist at the United Nations Commission for Latin America, went on to conclude that the underdeveloped nations must employ some degree of protectionism in trade if they were to enter a self-sustaining development path. He argued that import substitution industrialization, not a trade and export orientation, was the best strategy for underdeveloped countries. The theory was developed from a Marxian perspective by Paul A. Barron in 1957 with the publication of his The Political Economy of Growth. Dependency theory shares many points with earlier, Marxist, theories of imperialism by Rosa Luxemburg and V. I. Lenin, and has attracted continued interest from Marxists. Macias Vernongo, a University of Utah economist, identifies two main streams in dependency theory: the Latin American structuralist, typified by the work of Prebisch, Celso Furtado and Aníbal Pinto at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, and the American Marxist, developed by Paul A. Barron, Paul Sweezy, and André Gunder Frank. Using the Latin American dependency model, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the Guyanese Marxist historian, Walter Rodney, described an Africa that had been consciously exploited by European imperialists, leading directly to the modern underdevelopment of most of the continent. The theory was popular in the 1960s and 1970s as a criticism of modernization theory, which was falling increasingly out of favor because of continued widespread poverty in much of the world. Many dependency theorists advocate social revolution as an effective means to the reduction of economic disparities in the world system. According to Vernongo, the Latin American structuralist and the American Marxist schools had significant differences but agreed on some basic points. Both groups would agree that at the core of the dependency relation between center and periphery lies the inability of the periphery to develop an autonomous and dynamic process of technological innovation. Technology the Promethean force unleashed by the Industrial Revolution is at the center of stage. The center countries controlled the technology and the systems for generating technology. Foreign capital could not solve the problem, since it only led to limited transmission of technology, but not the process of innovation itself. Barron and others frequently spoke of the international division of labor skilled workers in the center, and skilled in the periphery euro, when discussing key features of dependency. Barron placed surplus extraction and capital accumulation at the center of his analysis. Development depends on a population's producing more than it needs for bare subsistence. Further, some of that surplus must be used for capital accumulation, the purchase of new means of production, if development is to occur. Spending the surplus on things like luxury consumption does not produce development. Barron noted two predominant kinds of economic activity in poor countries. In the older of the two, plantation agriculture, which originated in colonial times, most of the surplus goes to the landowners, who use it to emulate the consumption patterns of wealthy people in the developed world. Much of it thus goes to purchase foreign-produced luxury items, automobiles, clothes, etc., and little is accumulated for investing in development. The more recent kind of economic activity in the periphery is industria, but of a particular kind. It is usually carried out by foreigners, although often in conjunction with local interests. It is often under special tariff protection or other government concessions. The surplus from this production mostly goes to two places: part of it is sent back to the foreign shareholders as profit. The other part is spent on conspicuous consumption in a similar fashion to that of the plantation aristocracy. Again, little is used for development. Barron thought that political revolution was necessary to break this pattern. In the 1960s, members of the Latin American structuralist school argued that there is more latitude in the system than the Marxists believed. They argued that it allows for partial development or dependent development, euro development, but still under the control of outside decision-makers. They cited the partly successful attempts at industrialization in Latin America around that time as evidence for this hypothesis. They were led to the position that dependency is not a relation between commodity exporters and industrialized countries, but between countries with different degrees of industrialization. In their approach there is a distinction made between the economic and political spheres. Economically, one may be developed or underdeveloped. But even if economically developed, one may be politically autonomous or dependent. More recently, Guillermo O'Donnell has argued that constraints placed on development by neoliberalism were lifted by the military coups in Latin America that came to promote development in authoritarian guise. The importance of technology, multinational corporations, and state promotion of technology were emphasized by the Latin American structuralists. Ford Zibler has made a distinction between systemic or authentic competitiveness, which is the ability to compete based on higher productivity, and spurious competitiveness, which is based on low wages. The Third World debt crisis of the 1980s and continued stagnation in Africa and Latin America in the 1990s caused some doubt as to the feasibility or desirability of dependent development. Bernango has suggested that the sine qua non of the dependency relationship is not the difference in technological sophistication, as traditional dependency theorists believe, but rather the difference in financial strength between core and peripheral countries, particularly the inability of peripheral countries to borrow in their own currency. He believes that the hegemonic position of the United States is very strong because of the importance of its financial markets and because it controls the international reserve currency, the US dollar. He believes that the end of the Bretton Woods international financial agreements in the early 1970s considerably strengthened the United States' position because it removed some constraints on their financial actions. Standard dependency theory differs from Marxism, in arguing against internationalism and any hope of progress in less developed nations towards industrialization and a liberating revolution. Theotonio dos Santos described a new dependency, which focused on both the internal and external relations of less developed countries of the periphery, derived from a Marxian analysis. Former Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso wrote extensively on dependency theory while in political exile during the 1960s, arguing that it was an approach to studying the economic disparities between the center and periphery. The American sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein refined the Marxist aspect of the theory, and called it the world system. It has also been associated with Galtung's structural theory of imperialism. With the economic growth of India and some East Asian economies, dependency theory has lost some of its former influence. It still influences some NGO campaigns, such as Make Poverty History and the Fair Trade movement. Other dependency theorists, two other early writers relevant to dependency theory were Frana Section-Wapiru and Kurt Rothschild. Other leading dependency theorists including Herb Addo, Walden Bello, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Enzo Folletto, Armando Cordova, Ernest Feder, Andre Gunder Frank, Walter Rodney, Pablo González Casanova, Keith Griffin, Cunibert Raffa, Paul Israel Singer, and Osvaldo Sunkel. Many of these authors focus their attention on Latin America. The leading dependency theorist in the Islamic world is the Egyptian economist Samir Amin. Later, world systems theory expanded on dependency arguments. It postulates a third category of countries, the semi-periphery, intermediate between the core and periphery. In this model, the semi-periphery is industrialized, but with less sophistication of technology than in the core. And it does not control finances. The rise of one group of semi-peripheries tends to be at the cost of another group, but the unequal structure of the world economy based on unequal exchange tends to remain stable. Torsch traces the beginnings of world systems theory to the writings of the Austro-Hungarian socialist Karl Polanyi after the First World War. In its present form it is usually associated with the work of Immanuel Wallerstein. Sociologist Fernando Henrique Cardoso summarized his version of dependency theory as follows: there is a financial and technological penetration by the developed capitalist centers of the countries of the periphery and semi-periphery. This produces an unbalanced economic structure both within the peripheral societies and between them and the centers. This leads to limitations on self-sustained growth in the periphery. This favors the appearance of specific patterns of class relations. These require modifications in the role of the state to guarantee both the functioning of the economy and the political articulation of a society, which contains, within itself, foci of inarticulateness and structural imbalance. Torsch, based on works of Amin from 1973 to 1997, lists the following main characteristics of periphery capitalism. Regression in both agriculture and small-scale industry characterizes the period after the onslaught of foreign domination and colonialism. Unequal international specialization of the periphery leads to the concentration of activities in export-oriented agriculture and/or mining. Some industrialization of the periphery is possible under the condition of low wages, which, together with rising productivity, determine that unequal exchange sets in. These structures determine in the long run a rapidly growing tertiary sector with hidden unemployment and the rising importance of rent in the overall social and economic system, chronic current account balance deficits, re-exported profits of foreign investments, and efficient business cycles at the periphery that provide important markets for the centers during world economic upswings, structural imbalances in the political and social relationships, inter alia a strong comprador element and the rising importance of state capitalism and an indebted state class. The analysis of development patterns in the 1990s and beyond is complicated by the fact that capitalism develops not smoothly, but with very strong and self-repeating ups and downs, called cycles. Relevant results are given in studies by Joshua Goldstein, Volker Bonnier, and Luigi Scandella. Dependency theorists hold that short-term spurts of growth notwithstanding, long-term growth in the periphery will be imbalanced and unequal, and will tend towards high negative current account balances. Cyclical fluctuations also have a profound effect on cross-national comparisons of economic growth and societal development in the medium and long run. What seemed like spectacular long-run growth, may in the end turn out to be just a short-run cyclical spurt after a long recession. Cycle time plays an important role. Giovanni Arrighi believed that the logic of accumulation on a world scale shifts over time, and that we again witnessed during the 1980s and beyond a deregulated phase of world capitalism with a logic, characterized, in contrast to earlier regulatory cycles, by the dominance of financial capital. At this stage, the role of unequal exchange in the entire relationship of dependency cannot be underestimated. Unequal exchange is given, if double factorial terms of trade of the respective country are less than 1.0. Criticism: Dependency theory has been criticized by free market economists such as Peter Baugh and Martin Wolf. Corruption. State-owned companies have higher rates of corruption than privately owned companies. Lack of competition. By subsidizing in-country industries and preventing outside imports, these companies may have less incentive to improve their products, to try to become more efficient in their processes, to please customers, or to research new innovations. Sustainability. Industries reliant on government support may not be sustainable for very long, particularly in poorer countries and countries which largely depend on foreign aid from more developed countries. Domestic opportunity costs. Subsidies on domestic industries come out of state coffers and therefore represent money not spent in other ways, like development of domestic infrastructure, seed capital or need-based social welfare programs. At the same time, the higher prices caused by tariffs and restrictions on imports require the people either to forego these goods altogether or buy them at higher prices, foregoing other goods. Market economists cite a number of examples in their arguments against dependency theory. The improvement of India's economy after it moved from state-controlled business to open trade is one of the most often cited. India's example seems to contradict dependency theorists' claims concerning comparative advantage and mobility, as much as its economic growth originated from movements such as outsourcing, one of the most mobile forms of capital transfer. South Korea and North Korea provide another example of trade-based development versus autarkic self-sufficiency. When the two states were divided at the end of the Korean War, they possessed roughly identical populations, resources and infrastructure and were at similar levels of development. North Korea pursued a policy of import substitution industrialization as suggested by dependency theory, while South Korea pursued a policy of export-oriented industrialization as suggested by comparative advantage theory. In 2013 South Korea's per capita GDP was 18 times that of North Korea. In Africa, states which have emphasized import substitution development, such as Zimbabwe, have typically been among the worst performers, while the continent's most successful non-oil-based economies such as Egypt, South Africa and Tunisia, have pursued trade-based development. Free market theorists see dependency theorists' complaints as legitimate, but their policy prescriptions as terrible, in that the policies only aggravate the disparity between the developed nations and the underdeveloped countries. See also, Chicago Boys, The Shock Doctrine, by Naomi Klein, discussing economics shock therapy, Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, aka, School of the Americas, Structural Adjustment, World Systems Theory, North-South Model, Immanuel Wallerstein, References. Further reading, Amin S., Unequal Development, An Essay on the Social Formations of Peripheral Capitalism New York, Monthly Review Press. Amin S., Rereading the Postwar Period, An Intellectual Itinerary translated by Michael Wolfers. New York, Monthly Review Press. Amin S., Die Zukunft des Weltsystems. Herausforderungen der Globalisierung. Herausgegeben und aus dem Französischen übersetzt von Joachim Wieck Hamburg, VSA. Bonnier v. Wachstum, Konzentration und Multinationalisierung von Industrieunternehmen Frauenfeld und Stuttgart, Huber. Bonnier v. Western Society in Transition New Brunswick New Jersey Transaction Publishers. Bonnier v. and Chase, Dunn-C, Transnational Corporations and Underdevelopment NY, NY Praeger. Cardoso, F.H. and Folletto, E., Dependency and Development in Latin Arma Copyright Rica. University of California Press. James, Paul. Post-Dependency, The Third World in an Era of Globalism and Late Capitalism. Alternatives, Social Transformation and Human Governance. Volume 22, pages 205-26. Car paragraph led G. and Torche Global Keynesianism, Unequal Exchange and Global Exploitation. Huntington N.Y., Nova Science. Sunkalo, The Structural Background of Development Problems in Latin America Weltwirtschaftliches Archiv, 97, 1, pp. 22 ff. Sunkalo, El Subdesarrollo Latinoamericano y la Teoría del Desarrollo Mexico, Siglo Vianterino editors, 6th edition. Torche, Towards a Socio-Liberal Theory of World Development Basingstoke and New York, Macmillan St. Martin's Press. Torche and Peter Herriman Globalization and European Integration. Huntington NY, Nova Science. Torche, Social Cohesion, Sustainable Development and Turkey's Accession to the European Union, Implications from a Global Model, Alternatives, Turkish Journal of International Relations, 2, 1, Spring 2003. Iotopoulos P. and Sueda Y., Free Currency Markets, Financial Crises and the Growth Debacle, Is There a Causal Relationship? Revised November 1999, Stanford University, USA, and University of Tokyo. Iotopoulos P. and Sueda Y., Exchange Rate Misalignment, A New Test of Long-Run PPP Based on Cross-Country Data, February 2005, Faculty of Economics, University of Tokyo. External links, Centro Argentino de Estudios Internacionales, ECLACCEPAL Santiago, Revista Antiliquia, University of Texas Inequality Project as Investment, Technology Transfers, and Closer Integration into the World Market. Dependency theory rejected this view, arguing that underdeveloped countries are not merely primitive versions of developed countries, but have unique features and structures of their own. And, importantly, are in the situation of being the weaker members in a world market economy. Dependency theory no longer has many proponents as an overall theory, but some writers have argued for its continuing relevance as a conceptual orientation to the global division of wealth. Basics. The premises of dependency theory are that, poor nations provide natural resources, cheap labor, a destination for obsolete technology, and markets for developed nations, without which the latter could not have the standard of living they enjoy. Wealthy nations actively perpetuate a state of dependence by various means. This influence may be multifaceted, involving economics, media control, politics, banking and finance, education, culture, and sport. History. Dependency theory originates with two papers published in 1949, one by Hans Singer, one by Roy L. Prebisch, in which the authors observed that the terms of trade for underdeveloped countries relative to the developed countries had deteriorated over time. The underdeveloped countries were able to purchase fewer and fewer manufactured goods from the developed countries in exchange for a given quantity of their raw materials. Continued interest from Marxists. Meishes Vernongo, a University of Utah economist, identifies two main streams in dependency theory: the Latin American structuralist, typified by the work of Prebisch, Celso Furtado and Aníbal Pinto at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, and the American Marxist, developed by Paul A. Barron, Paul Sweezy, and André Gunder Frank. Using the Latin American dependency model, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the Guyanese Marxist historian, Walter Rodney, described an Africa that had been consciously exploited by European imperialists, leading directly to the modern underdevelopment of most of the continent. The dependency theory is the notion that resources flow from a periphery of poor and underdeveloped states to a core of wealthy states, enriching the latter at the expense of the former. It is a central contention of dependency theory that poor states are impoverished and rich ones enriched by the way poor states are integrated into the world system. The theory arose as a reaction to modernization theory, an earlier theory of development which held that all societies progress through similar stages of development, that today's underdeveloped areas are thus in a similar situation to that of today's developed areas at some time in the past, and that therefore the task in helping the underdeveloped areas out of poverty is to accelerate them along this supposed common path of development, by various means such as sports. This idea is known as the Singer-Prebisch thesis. Prebisch, an Argentine economist at the United Nations Commission for Latin America, went on to conclude that the underdeveloped nations must employ some degree of protectionism in trade if they were to enter a self-sustaining development path. He argued that import substitution industrialization, not a trade and export orientation, was the best strategy for underdeveloped countries. The theory was developed from a Marxian perspective by Paul A. Barron in 1957 with the publication of his The Political Economy of Growth. Dependency theory shares many points with earlier, Marxist, theories of imperialism by Rosa Luxemburg and V. I. Lenin, and has attracted